The man known to history as Rudolf Höss was born as Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss on the 25th of November 1900 in Baden-Baden in Western Germany. His father was Franz Xaver Höss, a former German army officer who had served in the colony of German East Africa, situated roughly where Tanzania lies today. Later on, once back in Germany, he worked as a senior clerk at a merchant's house which specialized in the importation of tea and coffee. He was a strict, austere individual, one who raised Rudolf, the only boy of 4 children, according to strict Catholic and military principles. Rudolf's mother was Paulina Höss, whose maiden name was Speck. She was a housewife who raised Rudolf and his 3 sisters. The Höss household, which was based in Baden-Baden until Rudolf was 6 years of age, was prosperous owing to Rudolf's father's successful job. And later in life, Höss would nostalgically write about an idyllic childhood in which his horse was his closest companion. In many ways, it resembled a typical upper-middle-class German family of the early 20th century, particularly one that was deeply religious. When Rudolf was around 6 or 7 years of age, the Höss family moved to the nearby town of Mannheim, where Rudolf's education began under a private tutor. This continued for 2 years before he was enrolled in a local elementary school where he proved himself a capable, though hardly exceptional student. Rudolf's father, in line with the family's extreme Catholic piety, wished for his son to enter the priesthood, and after young Rudolf graduated from elementary school, he was enrolled in a humanities school with a view to potentially entering a seminary in due course. But his father's wish for Rudolf to follow this path was scuppered in the early 1910s, when Rudolf's father died. With the influence which was driving him towards the priesthood removed, Rudolf would begin to gravitate towards a life in the military. Yet this was not an unusual pursuit in early 20th century Germany, a country which was filled with nationalist sentiment. Höss was born and was growing up just as Europe was bubbling over with a vast assortment of tensions and resentments rising between the great powers. Most of this focused on Germany. When the country had united into the Second German Reich in 1871, this severely disrupted the power balance across Europe. Germany was now a threat to Britain, which for long had been Europe's foremost power. As a result, in the decades that followed, a series of military alliances were concluded by the major powers, one consisting of Britain, France, and Russia, and the other of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. These powers would constantly clash in the early 20th century over rivalry for colonial possessions and other matters. Added to this division of the continent into 2 armed camps was a host of other problems, foremost amongst which was nationalist tensions in regions such as the Balkans, where the Ottoman Turkish Empire was collapsing, and both Austria, Hungary, and Russia wanted to step into the vacuum created by Istanbul's political and military collapse. Yet other groupings within the Balkans, such as the Serbs, had other ideas about this. Eventually, it would be the desire of these ethnic people to establish their own states, which would see Europe enveloped in war. The outbreak of a major conflict in Europe would have profound implications for Höss, despite the fact that he was still in his early teenage years. The war, which both then as well as in retrospect seemed somewhat inevitable, eventually broke out in the summer of 1914. The pressure cooker that was the Balkans was the source. In late June, while on a state visit to the city of Sarajevo, the heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Serb nationalist. Then, in the weeks that followed, the Austrian government in Vienna attempted to exploit the situation in order to crush the nascent Serbian state on its southeastern border and curb the rising nationalist wave in the Balkans more generally. In response, Russia began mobilizing its troops in the region, and the situation then gradually escalated as Germany, Britain, and France all began trading threats in late July of 1914. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia in defense of its Austrian ally and on the 3rd of August, Berlin opened a second front by declaring war on France. A day later, Germany invaded neutral Belgium, which led Britain in turn to declare war on Germany. Thus, the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ballooned in the weeks that followed into the outbreak of the First World War. Despite being only 13 years of age upon the outbreak of the conflict, Höss was soon involved. In 1915, having turned 14 the previous year, he abandoned plans to join the priesthood and decided to follow in his father's footsteps. As such, he joined the German army and, despite his age, was allowed to enlist in the 21st Reserve Squadron of the 2nd Baden Dragoon Regiment, the regiment which both his father and grandfather had previously served in. After 4 weeks of initial training, his unit was amalgamated into the German Army's Asia Corps, which was assigned to serve alongside the 6th Army of the Ottoman Turks, one of Germany's foremost allies in the Middle East. Then, between 1916 and 1918, he fought in several campaigns in the region around modern-day Iraq and Palestine, and it has been noted that he may have witnessed some of the atrocities which amounted to the genocide by the Ottoman Turks of 1.5 million Armenians during the course of the war in Turkey. He was also wounded 3 times during his service and received the Iron Cross Second Class as well as the Iron Crescent, the latter being a commendation from the Turkish government. Finally, in the spring of 1918, he was even placed in command of his own cavalry unit, despite still being only 17 years of age. The First World War came to an end in November 1918. It had been a tortuous affair. While the British and their allies had gained the upper hand in the Middle East campaign, the main arena of fighting was in northern France, where the Germans had fought the French and the British over a small portion of land for 4 years. The entry of the United States into the war in 1917 provided these Western allies with an injection of men and resources. This happened just as Germany's ability to maintain its war effort was diminishing, and despite its effective victory over Russia in 1917, when the revolutionary government of that country had elected to give away vast tracts of land in Eastern Europe in return for the ability to leave the war. But in the end, owing to dissent at home in Germany and a realization that the war could not be won, a full-blown invasion of Germany was not needed in 1918, before the country surrendered, effectively bringing the war to an end and bringing victory to Britain, France and their allies, and utter defeat for Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Turks. When the news of the armistice reached the Middle East, Höss was stationed in Damascus, a city which he quickly left, returning to Germany in secret in order to avoid being placed in an internment camp as a German officer. Höss's return to Germany was not idyllic. His mother had died during his absence in the Middle East, and he soon clashed with the remaining members of his family who wished for him to return to his path to the priesthood which his deceased parents had set him on before the war had interrupted affairs. Instead, Höss became a quite disaffected individual, unhappy with the humiliating peace terms which Britain and France had imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the war to an end. And he wasn't alone in his disaffection. In the immediate aftermath of the war, tens of thousands of former German soldiers and officers began forming themselves into quasi-military associations, such as the East Prussian Free Corps and the Steel Helmet League of Frontline Soldiers. These were partly social clubs for army veterans, but also partly borderline paramilitary groups, some of which posed a genuine threat to the peace and stability of the Weimar Republic, which had been established to govern Germany in the aftermath of the war. Höss soon joined the East Prussian Free Corps, or Freikorps, which was associated with the government in curbing workers' strikes and other bouts of unrest in Germany during the early 1920s. It was the beginning of his association with fringe paramilitary groups in interwar Germany. During the course of the early 1920s, the Freikorps were involved in some controversial activities and ones which were indicative of Höss's increasingly right-wing and violent political leanings. For instance, in 1920, he was part of a group which curbed some unrest in East Prussia, while just months later, his brigade of Freikorps aggressively broke up a strike by industrial workers in the Ruhr area of western Germany. Consequently, it is not surprising to find that when the Freikorps were disbanded by the German government in 1922, Höss gravitated to a different right-wing movement. This was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short, which had been established in Munich in 1920 and which by 1922 was coming increasingly under the control of an Austrian firebrand by the name of Adolf Hitler. And, having heard a speech delivered by Hitler while in the Bavarian capital, Höss decided to join the party, becoming member number 3240. It was the beginning of a quarter of a century-long association with a party whose ideology would shape Höss's life. And that ideology was based around authoritarianism, retaliation for Germany's loss in the war, and xenophobia, but above all, a searing anti-Semitism against the Jews of Germany and Europe more broadly. Höss was soon involved with the Nazi Party in a substantial capacity. In January 1923, following the Weimar government's failure to meet some of its war reparations payments, French and Belgian troops occupied parts of the heavily industrialized Upper Rhine region of Western Germany. Höss became part of a group which organized acts of sabotage and violence against the occupiers, and in this capacity, he and two other former members of the Freikorps murdered a local schoolteacher, Walter Kadolf, who had acted as an informer for the French. The act was carried out on a farm belonging to Martin Bormann, later a personal secretary to Hitler and senior government figure. Later, both Höss and Bormann were arrested for the crime, and in March 1923, Höss was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in murdering Kadolf. As a result, Höss was unable to take part in an attempted military rebellion, or putsch, which the Nazi Party launched in Munich in November 1923. It was a complete failure, and Hitler too found himself imprisoned for several years shortly thereafter. However, in acts of leniency which all of Europe would come to regret, Hitler was released after serving less than a year of his sentence, and Höss was released after he had served just half of his 10-year sentence. Having served 5 years in prison, Höss was released in the late 1920s as the situation in Germany was shifting. After a decade of economic expansion throughout Europe and North America, and a boom period which led to these years becoming known as the Roaring Twenties, an abrupt financial crash occurred in the autumn of 1929. The Wall Street crash and the Great Depression which followed it for years afterwards had profound consequences for Germany, and as ordinary people lost their jobs and life savings, they turned to extremist parties in local and national elections. Thus, the Nazis, who had been a small fringe group for outcasts and disaffected extremists up to that point, suddenly started to grow quickly in popularity, eventually becoming the largest political party in Germany in the early 1930s. Meanwhile, following his release, Höss decided to take a back seat from politics himself, although he did maintain ties with the Nazis. In the immediate aftermath of his release, his main priority was starting a family. Consequently, in the late summer of 1929, he married Hedwig Hensel, whom he had met through the Artemann League, a German rural, agrarian, and traditionalist movement which he had become involved with following his release from prison. They would go on to have 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. Höss kept a low profile for the next several years, but Hitler and his Nazi Party decidedly did not. In 1932, they became the most popular party in Germany, with nearly 40% of the vote in one election. Still, they could not gain a majority, and never would have, had it not been for a Faustian pact which the leaders of Germany's major industrial companies now made with Hitler, banking on the fact that they could control Hitler and the Nazis and use them to ensure that the communists would not come to power in Germany. Industrialists such as Gustav Krupp threw their support behind Hitler in early 1933. Within weeks, the Nazis exploited this situation to dismantle the Weimar Republic, ban the communists and other opposition groups, and essentially turn Germany into a one-party dictatorship. And this was the spur for Höss to re-enter political life. In September 1933, he joined the Schutzstaffel, or SS, one of the main paramilitary wings of the Nazi Party, and quickly became a firm ally of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Significantly, in July 1934, the SS were granted control and oversight over the concentration camps which the Nazis had begun establishing in Germany as soon as they had seized power. At this early date, these were relatively small, makeshift prisons used to house political opponents of the nascent Nazi regimes, such as communists and other left-leaning political groups. In June 1934, Höss was transferred to the 10th Battalion of the 9th Regiment of the SS, but it was only a temporary posting, and in December of that year, he was transferred again, this time to Dachau, a concentration camp which had recently been constructed near Munich in Bavaria. Here, he served under the camp inspector Theodor Eicke for the next several weeks. It was Eicke who developed the system of camp discipline, which would subsequently be extended to the concentration camps throughout Europe. Höss spent nearly 4 years here, during which time he was a relatively low-profile figure. However, his experience and the length of time spent there were sufficient enough that when the Nazis began consolidating the smaller concentration camps into bigger camps in the late 1930s, he was transferred to one of these larger internment facilities. This one was just north of Berlin and was called Sachsenhausen. Here, Höss was placed in an administrative role upon his arrival on the 1st of August 1938, and he would soon be promoted to more senior positions, eventually being appointed as commandant deputy for prisoner affairs there, one of the most senior positions within the camp administration. Simultaneously, he rapidly acquired promotion within the SS, becoming a captain by the winter of 1938. While Höss was at Sachsenhausen, the Nazi state which he served was dragging Europe towards conflict. As soon as Hitler and the Nazis had come to power in 1933, they had begun to dismantle the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the stipulations of the treaty was that Germany would restrict the size of its army. The Nazis quickly breached this provision and began rebuilding both the armed forces and a new German Air Force. Then, a second major point was violated in March 1936, when Hitler sent German troops into the Rhineland, the industrialized western part of Germany which, under the terms of Versailles, was to be left demilitarized. And when this went relatively unopposed, Berlin moved 2 years later to annex Austria into a Greater Germany, in the so-called Anschluss. Then, by the end of the year, Hitler also pressurized Britain into allowing it to incorporate the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia into Germany as well. By now, the Nazis were convinced by the constant appeasement afforded them by Britain and France that little would be done to stop them. In the spring of 1939, they were allowed to form Czechoslovakia and Hungary into puppet states. But a few months later, their run of conquests without a shot ran out. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the two Western powers declared war in response on the 3rd of September. The Second World War had commenced. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, Höss had joined the Waffen-SS, the more hardcore military branch of the paramilitary organization. He was subsequently sent east into Poland following the conquest of the country, and it is this country that he would become most closely associated with for the remainder of his life. As soon as the German Reich had begun expanding into regions such as Austria and Poland in 1938 and 1939, concentration camps had been established in those countries to house political prisoners and members of those groupings which the Nazi state reserved its naked hatred for, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, Gypsies, and, above all, the Jewish people. The latter were particularly numerous in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, as, in the late medieval period, most Western European kingdoms such as England and France had forcibly expelled their Jewish communities, and, as they did, a great many of Europe's Jews had migrated eastwards to places such as Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic Sea region. Consequently, as the Nazi state conquered Poland in 1939, it began to encounter ever greater numbers of Jewish people in Eastern Europe and decided that more concentration camps would be needed in Poland to detain them. Höss would become central to these operations. Late in 1939, Höss had been appointed as an interim director of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, but he was soon to be moved from this position. In February 1940, surveyors and SS members in Poland had begun examining the site of an old Polish army barracks, situated about 50 kilometers south of the city of Krakow. It was in a relatively isolated rural setting, but the former barracks and buildings around it could be used as the beginnings of a major concentration camp. Moreover, it was situated in an ideal place geographically, not too far from Germany, and at a crossroads of several large train transit routes to the east. The barracks lay next to a village called Oświęcim in Polish, but the whole world knows it today by its German name. It was called Auschwitz. Then, on Himmler's recommendation, Höss was sent there in April 1940 to carry out an inspection of the site and to report to him on the feasibility of going ahead with siting a concentration camp here. Höss visited and approved of the location, so on the 27th of April 1940, Himmler gave the order to establish what is now known as Camp 1 at Auschwitz, or Auschwitz I, with an initial capacity of 10,000 prisoners. Rudolf Höss was appointed as commandant of the new camp a few days later, on the 1st of May. Over the next 3.5 years, Auschwitz would expand to become the largest and most horrific concentration camp in Nazi Europe, but much of that would lay ahead in 1942 and later. In 1940, Höss began to develop Auschwitz into a medium-sized concentration camp modelled on Dachau and Sachsenhausen, where he had served previously. Höss oversaw the conversion of the old army barracks and also established an agricultural farm to make the camp self-supporting. In line with the situation at many of the concentration camps being established throughout Eastern Europe, structures were also put in place in order to establish factories at Auschwitz, ones which would be run by the SS to produce war material, and which would effectively be powered by the slave labor of the inmates of the camp. When Himmler visited at the beginning of March 1941, he was impressed with the manner in which Höss had developed the main camp at Auschwitz. As a result, he ordered Höss to expand the camp so that it could hold 30,000 prisoners, as the concentration camp system was expected to come under pressure once Germany invaded Russia in the late summer and autumn of 1941. And most ominously, Himmler, with Höss eager to undertake the task, ordered the construction of a second camp nearby for a further 100,000 POWs. Camp 2, or Auschwitz II, would become known as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz might have remained a typical concentration camp, one of many established by the Nazis throughout Europe, where POWs and political dissidents were held in poor conditions, had it not been for the events of late 1941 and early 1942. Having conquered most of Western Europe, Hitler turned his attentions east towards the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. A massive invasion of Russia was commenced with in June 1941. Initially, it met with striking success, and the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin was considering negotiating peace terms with Germany, whereby huge tracts of land would be ceded to the Nazi state. And this was the climate in which Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy began to consider brutal ideas about how to solve what they termed the Jewish question. For years, the Nazis had used coercion and persecution to try to force the Jewish community of Germany and later in occupied lands to immigrate to either the British-mandated territory in Palestine or else to America and Britain. And there was even a bizarre plan to deport Europe's Jews to the East African island of Madagascar. All of this, though, changed in the winter of 1941 to 1942, in ways which would make Höss and the camp he ran at Auschwitz into something far different to the concentration camp which was originally established in 1940. In January 1942, a conference was held at Wannsee outside Berlin where some of the highest-ranking officials of the Third Reich met to discuss the Jewish question. The Nazis had begun to entertain truly horrific policy proposals at the time. One, for instance, had imagined that in order to create Lebensraum, or living space for German settlers, approximately 30 million Eastern Europeans would be starved to death. And in approaching the question of Europe's Jews at the Wannsee Conference, it was decided to engage in mass murder and genocide. Europe's Jews would effectively be detained and transported to the many concentration camps that had been established throughout Central and Eastern Europe, where they would be gassed to death. This was known euphemistically as the final solution, and the goal of it was to eradicate the Jewish population of the Third Reich. With its large facilities, its relative obscurity and distance from any major cities and towns, and its location on the main routeways and train routes of Eastern Europe, Auschwitz, and specifically Auschwitz-Birkenau, would become the epicenter of the genocidal policy, which was now to be enacted, and Rudolf Höss, more than any other individual, would become the overseer of the Holocaust. It should be noted that the Wannsee Conference was just the event at which the final solution was rubber-stamped, and at which the senior echelons of the Nazi state were alerted to what had been decided upon. However, the decision to commence a genocidal policy had been taken by Hitler and other senior officials such as Joseph Goebbels and Himmler months earlier. Additionally, Höss appears to have been one of the first to learn about it, and he later claimed that he had been told as early as the summer of 1941 to begin adapting the second camp, which was being developed at Auschwitz, the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, to serve as an extermination camp or death camp, rather than as a holding camp for prisoners. It was also at Auschwitz on the 3rd of September 1941 that an experiment with far-reaching consequences was conducted. That day, in the cellars of Block 11, over 800 POWs, most of them Soviet prisoners, were gassed to death using the gas prussic or hydrocyanic acid. It is better known by its commercial name, Zyklon B. Thus, by the early autumn of 1941, well in advance of the Wannsee Conference, Höss was preparing Auschwitz-Birkenau to act as an extermination camp, and the gas which would murder millions of Europe's Jews in the years that followed had already been trialed here. Shortly after the Wannsee Conference, trains began arriving to Auschwitz carrying the first Jews to Höss's camps. The newly arrived prisoners were generally killed with Zyklon B within hours of their arrival in a specially designed charnel house next to a crematorium in the camp. Before they were killed, prisoners were stripped of their few remaining possessions. Only those who were deemed physically fit enough to be able to work for a long time at the labor camps survived for very long, and soon the number of prisoners arriving was so large that Höss had to repurpose several other buildings to act as gas chambers. Strikingly though, the main cause of delays at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the months that followed was an inability to dispose of the bodies of those who had been murdered quickly enough. In response, Höss ordered the construction of 4 large units, each one consisting of a specially designed gas chamber with an attached crematorium. In the meantime, while these units were under construction, in the late summer and early autumn of 1942, many of the bodies of the deceased were simply piled up and incinerated on pyres outside in the open. Such was the scale of the murder machine at Auschwitz and the number of prisoners who went through the camps there that some people have called into question whether or not the place could have been operated on the scale which it did. But there is no doubting this. In terms of its scale, the concentration camp in its entirety was vast. When it was fully developed, Auschwitz consisted of 3 camps: the original camp, or Auschwitz I, the second camp, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the bulk of the murders took place, and a small third camp, Auschwitz-Monowitz, which was developed as a labor camp for the production of products such as synthetic rubber for the German war machine. These 3 camps, which made up Auschwitz and over which Höss presided as commandant, covered a huge area of land measuring some 20,000 acres or 8,000 hectares, and to ensure secrecy, the entire area had been cleared of any civilians, while a cordon sanitaire or empty zone was also established all around the periphery. Moreover, the Nazis also made efforts to convince civilians in the surrounding Polish countryside that things were different to what they seemed. For instance, when prisoners from the worker camp of Auschwitz-Monowitz were taken out of the camp, they were told to shave beforehand and were made to sing when within earshot of others. Life in the camps for the minority who were not murdered within hours of arriving was brutal. Some were spared because they were healthy and would make the best workers in the labor camps. Sometimes entire families avoided being sent directly to the gas chamber so that they could populate the family camp, a separate camp which was maintained between September 1943 and July 1944 as a kind of propaganda camp designed to fool the outside world about what was occurring at Auschwitz. The family camp has been written about in recent years by one of the few individuals who survived its liquidation in the summer of 1944, Otto Dov Kulka, whose memoir, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death, presents a harrowing account of his time at Auschwitz as a child. Additionally, for those who did survive for weeks or months at Auschwitz, existence was essentially a process of dehumanization. Inmates were tattooed with a serial number on their left arm, while prisoners were forced to wear color-coded uniforms, depending on their race or alleged crime. For instance, Jewish inmates wore green and white striped clothes with a Star of David. Jehovah's Witnesses wore purple. Gay men, some 15,000 of whom were placed in the camps by the Nazi state, wore pink, and the Roma, vagrants, and prostitutes wore black. Perhaps the most striking accounts of life inside Auschwitz were found in the writings of Primo Levi, an Italian Jew who was incarcerated at Auschwitz-Monowitz from February 1944 until the camp was liberated nearly a year later. In his first account of his time at Auschwitz, entitled "If This Is a Man," Levi describes how even those prisoners who were spared the gas chamber generally died within 3 months from exhaustion and malnourishment. Levy's account is one in which everything else is effectively stripped away except raw survival. At Auschwitz, inmates were woken at 4:30 a.m. If they did not rise swiftly, they were beaten. Sanitation was appalling, and clean water was scarce for even drinking, let alone bathing. Breakfast consisted of tea and coffee, but rarely food, and this was the preparation for an 11-hour work day, although it was sometimes longer in summer. Lunch often consisted of little more than some watery soup, while the evening meal was bread, generally stale, with some cheese and meat. Prisoners had the option of rationing this latter allocation in order to have something to eat for breakfast. Sunday was a day off and the time for a weekly shower. Some inmates were allowed to receive mail, but even this small dignity was denied the Jewish occupants of what Dov Kulka called the Auschwitz Hades. The staff at the camp, which was virtually all under the jurisdiction of the SS, numbered just over 6,000 people, nearly all of them men. It was a surprisingly small number when one considers the scale of the mass murder which was carried out at Auschwitz. There was a paradoxical element to life there. For instance, Höss resided there with his wife and young children in a 2-story villa near the commandant's office and the administration building in Camp 1. This highlights the fact that, for all the horrors that could be witnessed in certain parts of the camp, in other areas there was an atmosphere of seeming normality, and this transferred further down the hierarchy. Within Auschwitz I, the main camp, there was a cinema and a theatre for the staff. Former guards have described it as a small town, one with a sports club and where dances were also occasionally held. Other administrators and guards described how the initial revulsion of what was occurring at Auschwitz-Birkenau soon gave way to a situation where they ignored what they were doing and seeing, and simply considered themselves to be cogs in a machine, whilst other guards noted that there was a culture of heavy drinking amongst the SS stationed there. The wider hierarchy of the Nazi state were well aware of what was occurring in Western Poland. It is relatively clear that Höss had been given directives to run the camp in the manner which he did, as early as the summer of 1941, and that these orders evidently came down from Hitler and Himmler as head of the SS. Public attestations to what was occurring at Auschwitz are plentiful. One of the most famous is surely the so-called Posen speeches, two speeches which Himmler made on the 4th and 6th of October 1943 in the town hall of Posen or Poznan in Poland. Throughout 1943, Himmler had been conducting a tour of Central and Eastern Europe to give speeches before regional groups of SS members in an effort to raise flagging morale, as the German war effort had been hit by severe setbacks. Some of these speeches were recorded and transcribed, and during the Posen speeches, Himmler quite clearly states that the Nazi state is actively conducting a genocidal mass murder of Europe's Jews at camps such as Auschwitz.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein, und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das fasst Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit.
Additionally, knowledge of this extended even to the less anti-Semitic and ideological members of the Nazi regime, such as the armaments minister and architect Albert Speer, for whom correspondence has recently been unearthed which shows that he was fully aware of what Himmler had said in Posen. There is no denying the brutality of life at Auschwitz, and that what was occurring at the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau was a poorly kept secret in Nazi Germany. The end results of it constitute one of the foremost crimes ever committed by human beings. In total, approximately 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1944. Of these, it is estimated that about 1.1 million were killed, a large proportion within just hours of arriving at the camp. And of the 1.1 million souls who perished within the sprawling death camp, the overwhelming majority, as many as 960,000, were Jewish. Ethnic Poles, who were political dissenters of some kind, were the second biggest cohort of victims, making up in the region of 75,000 fatalities, while the rest were a mix of Roma, Gypsies and political prisoners from across Nazi-occupied Europe. And it's not just the deaths that occurred here which are so abhorrent, but the cold, clinical nature of the way mass murder was carried out. People were brought to Auschwitz, processed, gassed to death, and then their bodies were dispensed with, all within a matter of hours, as though it were an administrative exercise in efficiency. Others were experimented on by the crazed Dr. Josef Mengele, while the camp guards engaged in petty acts of sadism against the small number of inmates who survived more than a few hours. Throughout all of this, Höss maintained a clinical efficiency. Individuals who had survived the camps and were still alive after the war to testify against him affirmed that when he was seen, Höss would typically be wearing a stony, emotionless expression. Chillingly, when he was once asked about the gassing procedure and the use of Zyklon B, Höss is said to have remarked that they knew when those inside the gas chamber were dead, a process which took up to 15 minutes as they were no longer alive when they stopped screaming. And yet, for all his cold, clinical efficiency, Höss was briefly replaced as commandant of Auschwitz. Perversely, this was due to two developments, one being an extramarital affair he engaged in with a political prisoner at the camp, Eleonora Hodis, and the second being an investigation into financial corruption amongst some of the senior SS officers at Auschwitz. Although Höss was not implicated himself, the simultaneous scandals ensured that he needed to be briefly replaced. Accordingly, between November 1943 and May 1944, he was absent from Auschwitz, serving as chief of Department DI within the SS Economic Administrative Central Office. Through this position, Höss was effectively placed in one of the senior oversight positions of the entire concentration camp system throughout Europe. Höss's move to become the chief of Department DI was theoretically a promotion, but he was soon taking steps to return to Auschwitz to oversee perhaps the most disturbing period of the camp's entire history. In March 1944, in response to efforts by the Hungarian government to negotiate the surrender with the Allies, Hitler ordered the invasion of Hungary, and shortly thereafter, Adolf Eichmann, one of the main orchestrators of the final solution, was sent to the region to oversee the murder of approximately 750,000 Jews living in Hungary. As a result, Höss now arranged for himself to return to Auschwitz as camp commandant, to oversee the carnage. Then, during a 6-month period between the late spring and the autumn of 1944, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered by the Nazis, most of them at Auschwitz, with trainloads of 3,000 Jews arriving per day during the summer. Höss was central to the entire operation, and it was even given the codename Aktion Höss. 80% of those who arrived at Auschwitz during these months were killed the same day that they arrived. Then, in the autumn of 1944, when this process was drawing to a conclusion, Höss had himself reposted to Ravensberg concentration camp near Berlin, as the Russians closed in on Auschwitz. The horror of what was occurring at Auschwitz and Höss's centrality to it was not going to remain unknown to the wider world for much longer. Even as the scale of the murders at the camp was accelerating, the course of the war was shifting dramatically against Nazi Germany. While the first 3 years of the conflict had seen a succession of victories for Hitler and his allies, the decision to invade Russia in 1941 changed all of this. That winter, the German advance stalled outside Moscow and several other Russian cities, just as the United States was entering the war on the side of the Allies, after an unprovoked attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan. In tandem, the Axis were largely defeated in North Africa during the course of 1942, laying the way for the US and Britain to open a southern front in Sicily in the summer of 1943. A final cataclysmic conflict between the Russians and the Germans played out around the city of Stalingrad in the autumn and winter of 1942. When the snows melted there, early in 1943, the German Sixth Army had been destroyed, and the Russians were on their way west towards Berlin. It was now only a matter of when, not if, they would push into Poland and reach Auschwitz. And with the opening of a new front by the Western Allies in France in the summer of 1944, the Russian advance in the east accelerated. The Allies had information about what Höss and his underlings had perpetrated in Western Poland. Throughout the camp's history, there had been several escape attempts. One of these, on the 10th of April 1944, by 2 Slovak Jews, Rudolf Wurba and Alfred Wetzler, was successful, and after a 2-week odyssey across Poland, the pair made it to Slovakia, where they made contact with the Slovakian resistance movement. And there, they were able to give a complete report on what was happening at Auschwitz, including the schematics of the camp, information which was subsequently passed to the Western Allies. It was also proposed at this time that Auschwitz should be bombed by the Allies, and it remains a source of some controversy that the United States failed to do so, the American military high command having considered it and deemed the concentration camps there a target which would divert too many resources away from the bombing campaign in Western and Southern Europe. Had the Allies bombed the camps, it might have prevented, or at least slowed, the mass murder of nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews who were annihilated in a 6-month campaign after the Germans occupied the territory in March 1944. The Allies knew what they would find in Auschwitz when they reached there in 1945. Auschwitz was finally liberated on the 27th of January 1945. As the Soviet armies rampaged westwards across Poland in the late autumn and early winter of 1944, Höss and the other camp commanders had gradually began abandoning the camp, Höss electing to take up a position in another camp close to Berlin. Death was the creed of the place until the very end. One of the last acts undertaken by the camp authorities was to lead 60,000 prisoners on a death march on the 18th of January 1945 to Władysław Śląski, and roughly a quarter of these, some 15,000 people, died during the journey, either from starvation and the winter cold, or by simply being executed by their captors. Then, those who survived the journey were placed on freight trains to be ferried westwards to other concentration camps further back from the front lines. When the Soviets arrived at Auschwitz on the 27th, they found just 7,650 prisoners, virtually all of whom were sick, malnourished, or starving. Unsurprisingly, the reaction of the Soviet troops was one of being startled. Primo Levi would later write that their faces spoke of the feeling of guilt that such a crime should exist, that it should have been introduced irrevocably into the world of things that exist. Those who were still alive were held for medical treatment for days thereafter. As we have seen, Höss had relocated close to Berlin in the autumn of 1944, long before the Russians reached Auschwitz. Here, in addition to oversight of the Ravensbrück concentration camp near Berlin, he had some responsibility for the wider camp system throughout those portions of Central Europe which were still under Nazi control. Yet, when the final order came from Himmler to initiate the murder of the remaining inmates of Europe's camps, Höss lacked the resources to be able to implement the order, although there is no doubt that he would have done so had he been able to. Meanwhile, the Third Reich was entering its final stages. In the early spring of 1945, the Russians had begun to penetrate into eastern Germany and surrounded Berlin, while the Western Allies barreled into the Rhineland and headed towards Munich and Berlin themselves. Eventually, on the 30th of April 1945, with Berlin surrounded, Hitler killed himself in his bunker in the Reich Chancellery in the center of the capital. Just over a week later, on the 8th of May, Germany surrendered in what had become known as Victory in Europe, or VE Day. Now the war was over in Europe, it remained to apprehend those who had been responsible for it and for the terrible crimes which were committed during it. In the final days of the conflict, Höss met with his superior within the SS, Himmler. The pair had become close acquaintances during the course of the war, but Höss later testified that the meeting had left him feeling disheartened. Himmler proposed that all members of the SS should disguise themselves as standard members of the German army, the Wehrmacht, and await for the outbreak of a Third World War, which Himmler believed would follow soon after the end of the Second. Höss was indignant at the suggestion, but treated it as an order from his superior. Consequently, he quickly acquired the official papers of a member of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, and went into hiding on Sylt Island off the coast of northwestern Germany, near the border with Denmark. He was captured here sometime afterwards by some British soldiers, but they failed to accurately identify him, and Höss, who claimed that he was a farmer who had been forced to join the German Navy, was allowed to go free. Thereafter, he managed to escape detection by assuming the identity of Fritz Lang, a German farmer and gardener in the region. And he was not alone. All over Germany, high and mid-ranking members of the Nazi Party and the SS were adopting disguises and aliases in an effort to escape capture and prosecution by the Allies. Many of these individuals were able to escape detection for months or even years, and then many of them, such as the notorious participants of the Holocaust Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, were able to migrate overseas to South America, where these Nazi war criminals often managed to escape prosecution for years or even forever. But this was not the case with Höss. In early 1946, Rudolf's wife Hedwig was apprehended by British soldiers along with some of their children. She was eventually coerced into providing information as to her husband's whereabouts when the soldiers assaulted the Höss's son Klaus. As a result of this information, the British Field Security Police were able to apprehend Höss on the 11th of March 1946 at Gottröpel near the German-Danish border, 10 months after the conclusion of the war. He initially tried to bite into a cyanide pill to kill himself before he was captured, but after this failed, he tried to deny his identity. In this instance, he was betrayed by his wedding ring, which he was still wearing, and which had his name inscribed on the inside. In a fitting development, the team of British police which apprehended Höss was led by Hans Alexander, a German Jew whose family had relocated to Britain in 1936 to escape persecution by the Nazis. Following his arrest, Höss was initially imprisoned in a former army barracks at Heide, in the northern province of Schleswig-Holstein. From there, he was taken south to the main British centre for the interrogation of German war criminals in the town of Minden. He was quickly subpoenaed to appear as a witness for the defence of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich's Central Security Office between 1943 and 1945, and the successor to Reinhard Heydrich, who had organised the Wannsee Conference, at which the final solution was decided upon as Reich policy in January 1945. Kaltenbrunner was amongst the first group of individuals to face charges at the war crimes tribunals which the Allies were holding in the city of Nuremberg, and Höss testified there in April 1946. He was entirely unapologetic for his crimes, and even appears to have inflated the numbers of those who passed through the gates of Auschwitz and were murdered there during his time as commandant of the camp. He gave precise answers to the questions put to him and did not skirt the fact that well in excess of 1 million people had been killed at Auschwitz. He also did not seek to protect anyone, including Kaltenbrunner, on behalf of whose defense he had been called, nor did he try to evade responsibility himself. The only evasion he attempted was when he stated that he had been following Himmler's express orders as head of the SS. No sooner had Höss been captured than the Polish government petitioned to have him extradited to Poland so that he could stand trial and face justice in the country where Auschwitz stood and where Höss had overseen the murder of in excess of 1 million people, a huge number of them Polish citizens. This request was granted and Höss was sent to Poland on the 25th of May 1946. A Supreme National Tribunal had been established in Poland following the liberation of the country by the Russians with the purpose of trying major Nazi war criminals who had primarily operated in Poland between 1939 and 1945. The proceedings against Höss opened in Warsaw on the 11th of March 1947 to widespread international interest. He faced 2 main charges: being a member of a criminal organization, as the Nazi regime and the SS were now branded, and acting as the commandant of Auschwitz from the 1st of May 1940 through to October 1943, and again between the early summer and late autumn of 1944. The second charge included attendant charges of having been complicit in the murder of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, as well as the moral and psychological abuse of many others, as well as the profaning of the bodies of the dead. The trial lasted for just under 3 weeks. During it, experts on the Holocaust and Nazi and SS policy, as well as former prisoners from Auschwitz and even some staff members from the camp, were summoned to take the stand and testify against Höss. The commandant of Auschwitz behaved much as he had the previous year at the trial at Nuremberg. He provided precise, unemotional answers to the accusations made against him and displayed no remorse for his critical role in the murder of over 1 million people. He did try to depict himself at times as someone who was simply obeying orders in a hierarchy of officers, but he seemed resigned to facing the maximum sentence possible for his crimes. He also made a wholly illusory distinction between those who had been gassed and cremated at Auschwitz and those who had died from starvation or disease, as though those who had run the camp were somehow not responsible for the deaths of those who starved to death or became seriously ill within the camps. The trial lasted for less than 3 weeks and concluded on the 29th of March 1947. 4 days later, on the 2nd of April, Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death by hanging. Höss's final days were spent preparing his autobiography, which he had first been instructed to begin writing by the British after he was captured in Germany. Autobiographies are usually written by individuals who wish to extol their achievements in life and are typically intended to be read by individuals who might feel some modicum of admiration for the author. This one is very different in this respect, presenting an account of Höss's own life and also extensive details of other senior members of the SS whom Höss knew and worked with, notably Himmler and Theodor Eicke, whom he had first worked under at Sachsenhausen. Yet despite what we may make of the man himself, the autobiography has a utility for the historian as it is a relatively accurate document, much as he had done when questioned at trial. At both Nuremberg and in Warsaw, Höss made no effort to disguise the truth of what had occurred at Auschwitz and his role in it. As such, we have in his autobiography a first-hand account of how the Holocaust was carried out at its very epicenter and by one of its leading protagonists. Having first been published in Polish, it was soon translated into German and English, and has been reprinted in numerous editions since. Höss would not have long to wait between the announcement of his sentence on the 2nd of April and the execution of it, just 2 weeks to be precise. And shortly before his death, on the 10th of April, the man who had once been viewed as a potential priest by members of his religious family returned to the Roman Catholic Church and received the sacrament of penance. He also asked for permission to send a farewell letter to his family and to return his wedding ring to his wife. Additionally, he was psychologically evaluated, although his examiner, the American military psychologist Gustav Gilbert, could only conclude that Höss was somebody who could appear socially normal, but who was almost totally lacking in any capacity for empathy towards others. 4 days before his sentence was carried out, Höss sent a message to the state prosecutor in which he claimed to have realized that his actions were wrong. Similar thoughts suffuse his final letters to his family. His execution was carried out on the morning of the 16th of April 1947. Perhaps fittingly, Höss was hung just a few dozen yards from the villa where he and his family had lived for several years in Camp 1 at Auschwitz, near the first crematorium that was built there. At 8:10 a.m., he was pronounced dead by the court doctor. And what of Auschwitz itself, the place at which Höss oversaw so much death? Surprisingly, the liberation of the camp in January 1945 did not generate much international media attention that spring, and it was only with the liberation of camps such as Dachau by the Western Allies that the camp system became known to the wider world. But in the years that followed, Auschwitz became the primary symbol of the Holocaust, a result of the camp's high death toll and also due to the survival of many witnesses who could attest to what had happened there. In particular, the writings of figures such as Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel in the post-war years provided first-hand accounts of what had occurred in the Polish camp between 1942 and 1944. A museum was quickly opened there in the aftermath of the war, while in 1979 the camp was added to the list of World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. The gates to the camp have become one of the most ubiquitous images associated with the concentration camp system and the Holocaust, which was carried out within them. In 2005, the UN General Assembly designated the 27th of January as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day was selected as it was the date on which Auschwitz was liberated in 1945. Today, the camp is visited by roughly 2 million individuals every year. Rudolf Höss is one of several members of the Nazi regime who is perhaps less well known to the public than figures such as Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler, but who was nonetheless absolutely central to the Holocaust. As commandant of the camp at Auschwitz, for most of the period that it served as a concentration camp, between 1940 and January 1945, he oversaw the murder of over 1 million people, most of them Jewish people from Eastern and Central Europe, but also over 100,000 Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others such as Gypsies and the Roma people. Auschwitz became the center of the Holocaust, the place where approximately 1.1 million people were killed in gas chambers and then quickly had their bodies burned in the crematoria. It was here that over half of the 750,000 Jews of Hungary were killed in just a few short months in the summer and autumn of 1944. Only the concentration camps of Treblinka and Belzec in eastern Poland saw comparable levels of mass murder, with approximately 800,000 and 600,000 people killed here, though over a shorter time period than at Auschwitz. Moreover, the killing at Auschwitz was widely known about within the Nazi regime, from Hitler and Himmler down to regional officers who ran the SS. Today, its horror is vividly attested to by writers such as Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. Höss himself is an enigmatic character. He was certainly committed ideologically to the Nazi regime and its anti-Semitism. He grew up in a military family and became a soldier in the First World War when he was little more than a teenager. Thereafter, he was almost always surrounded by violence, from the Freikorps of the early 1920s through the Nazi Party in its early days, prison, and then the SS. Having been assigned to Dachau in the mid-1930s, he would spend the rest of his life administering concentration camps. First Dachau, then Sachsenhausen, and then Auschwitz. Perhaps he is the personification of what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, an individual who could run a machine of mass murder such as Auschwitz, as though it were an exercise in efficiency. He seems to have been capable of doing so. In the end, not because of any discernible sense of hatred, such as Hitler displayed towards Europe's Jews, but because he rarely displayed any emotion of any kind, a trait which was on display in the matter-of-fact way he conducted himself and answered questions at Nuremberg, and at his own trial in Warsaw. Perhaps that is the most chilling aspect to Höss, the idea that someone could engage in such mass murder almost unthinkingly and without any emotion. What do you think of Rudolf Höss? How much responsibility does he bear for the Holocaust overall? And to what extent was he personally responsible for turning Auschwitz into the hellish place which it became during the Second World War? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.